All right, now I'd like to welcome my colleague Dan Greenberg, who is General Counsel here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, I'm glad we have an experienced attorney here with an impressive professional history because we've got some serious legal issues to discuss. So we're going to start by talking about the law at issue here, and then we're going to move on to the human impact and the lawsuit connected to it. So start out, what is the mandatory repatriation tax?
Mandatory repatriation tax, and I'm going to try to speak in a non-technical way. I'm going to try to speak in English rather than speaking in tax law. The mandatory repatriation tax is a creature of the 2017 tax reforms, and you probably remember that the 2017 tax reforms were an attempt to change the nature of American tax law, to change it from a system where corporations were taxed no matter in what country their profits were derived, to a territorial system where corporations are only taxed from their domestic source profits. And the designers of the 2017 tax reform at a certain point realized that the numbers weren't adding up, and they were actually cutting taxes just a little bit too much, and they needed to make the books balance by inserting what's called a pay for clause, which meant that they would very slightly increase the amount of taxes that were taken in. And that is the origin of the MRT. The MRT essentially taxes American owners of foreign corporations who are persons. If you're a company that has ownership of foreign interests, you actually get a tax break or some kind of tax deduction, so it doesn't hit you very hard. But if you're an American who owns a piece or a share of a foreign corporation, then you get hit with a one-time repatriation tax.
Hmm. Now, well, let's make it more personal. Who are Kathleen and Charles Moore?
Kathleen and Charles Moore are a married couple who had a friend, Ravi. Let me make sure I get his name right. Um, uh, uh, who had a friend who was starting up a business, uh, uh, Kiss and Craft. That was a friend's business in India that sells affordable farming equipment, and there was a terrible need for this type of business enterprise in the subcontinent of India, because India's economy at that time and still today is not fully developed. And so when we think of people doing agriculture today, we think of them using power tools and other implements that you can buy at hardware stores and so forth. And in fact, the nature of Indian agriculture at this time involved a lot of use of things like hoes and plows that were not pushed by engines or gas power or by animals, but in fact by human backs, pushing plows back and forth. It really was sort of backbreaking labor. And so this company, Kiss and Craft, sold affordable farming equipment to serve poor rural farmers across India. And the Moores viewed this investment. They bought a piece of this business. They viewed this investment as not quite charity, but very public spirited, because they were motivated by the idea that they would be able to help develop India's economy and help struggling farmers and make food in India cheaper and more available. And in fact, their investment in Kiss and Craft was successful in one way, but unsuccessful in another way. It was successful in that the business boomed, and there's a great deal of delivery of agriculture implements to across India to these farmers. It was unsuccessful in that the Moores have never received a penny from their investment. They own basically right now. They own a piece of paper. They own a piece of paper, a share of the business that's gotten more valuable, right? But they've never received a penny of income from this business. And so it seemed paradoxical to them when they realized that Congress had passed a law that deemed the business profits that they'd never received to create tax liability, to create income for them. Congress taxed them on that. And so one day they learned that they had a tax bill due, an income tax bill, a one-time tax bill of approximately $15,000.
So because of this sort of weird situation that Kathleen or Charles in, we now have this lawsuit that is challenging the tax.
Yes.
Um, how long has it taken to get to this point? What path has this challenge taken up to now?
So Congress passed this law in 2017. The Moores first began to realize their tax liability in 2018. They immediately paid their tax obligations. Then they filed a second tax reform asking for a refund once they became more acquainted with the constitutional legal problems with this tax. Shortly thereafter they filed a second tax form asking for a refund and bringing up a case in tax court. And it's taken 5 years for that case to wend its way through the federal trial court and then the federal appellate court, and then an unsuccessful request for rehearing to federal appellate court, the Ninth Circuit out in California, or out in the California area, I should say. So now, about 5 years after they first realized that they were getting hit with this $15,000 income tax on the income that they had received, which is zero, they are now at the point where they are about to ask the Supreme Court of the United States to hear their case.
So this is an important distinction where we're not just saying we think that this is probably a bad idea that Congress passed this law in the first place, but that it is actually an unconstitutional law. So I think we can say that the Moores are pretty sympathetic plaintiffs, but I guess the question is, why does this constitutional prohibition on what kind of taxes we can have, why does this really matter? Why shouldn't, majorities in Congress just be able to pass whatever tax law they feel like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And to answer it, I have to talk a little bit about the nature of the Constitution and what the Constitution permits Congress to do and what it prohibits Congress from doing. Because the Constitution only permits certain types of taxes to be levied on the people. And so to understand the permissible zone of taxation, it's helpful to review constitutional text and constitutional history. And I have this passage from the Constitution that I will read to you, if that's all right. The Constitution says, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census." And what that means is that there are certain types of taxes that Congress cannot levy on the people. In particular, if it's a direct tax, Congress's authority is sharply limited. A direct tax is simply a tax, like an income tax or a property tax, or what's called a head tax. If Congress were to tax everyone $100 for having a head, right? A direct tax is up until the 16th Amendment. A direct tax is impermissible unless it's proportional. By which I mean Congress would have to look at the census, they'd have to look at the population of each state, and they'd have to say something like, here's a state that's relatively small. It has 1 million people in it. Here's another state that's relatively large. It has 10 million people in it. And so to satisfy the Constitution's proportionality requirement, the amount of direct taxes have to be 10 times. They have to be levied proportionally such that the taxes are 10 times in the bigger state than in the smaller state. You have to follow that ratio based on the count of the people, which is in the census. And so that's a limitation on direct taxes, and it makes it practically impossible for Congress to levy direct taxes. And that's why for the first part of American history, Congress received almost all of federal revenue through tariffs and excise taxes and so forth. That all changed when the 16th Amendment was passed. This was about the time, World War I. Congress realized, we have to spend a lot more money. We have to take in a lot more money and spend a lot more money for World War I. And so Congress passed an exception to this rule that prohibited, or practically prohibited, direct taxation. Income taxes, as of the 16th Amendment, became constitutionally permissible. And so as long as you have an income tax, a direct tax is perfectly okay. But there's another rule there, which is you can't just say anything you like is an income tax. An income tax actually has to tax income. it can't tax things that are not income if you want it to be an income tax. So in our view, this one-time tax that the Moors face is not an income tax because they never received any income from it. Our view is that the tax faced by the Moors is better understood as a property tax or a wealth tax. I think that that's pretty close to obvious. Again, it's not literally true that the Constitution prohibits federal property taxes or federal wealth taxes. They just have to follow that proportionality requirement. But that proportionality requirement means it's practically impossible to tax everyone in a proportional way. That tax that the Moors are facing is triggered by the fact that they own property, shares of a foreign company, on certain dates in 2017. Their ownership of the property was what triggered their tax obligation, not any income generating feature of the property. The way you figure out whether something's an income tax is not whether it's called an income tax. You look at its function. If a tax is called an income tax but functions as a property tax, we think it's improper to call it an income tax or treat it as an income tax. Does that begin to explain the case that the courts are bringing to the Supreme Court?
I think that does explain it. And as people would point out, our laws and our tax system has evolved over time. But as you pointed out, and that's absolutely true. But in order to get to this point, we needed an entire constitutional amendment, right, to make income taxes themselves legal. That wasn't a matter of just opening the gates and say, oh, well, now Congress can pass any tax it wants at any time for any reason.
Yes. Back then they did it the old-fashioned way. Of course, there was a period in the '60s, I think, when there was a social consensus that we don't really need we don't really need constitutional amendments to change the Constitution. We just need to have non-lawyers to sit on the Supreme Court to change the Constitution through the magic of interpretation. But I do feel now that we're in a new era where new lawmaking, new rights cannot slide through the process of constitutional interpretation in a way that they have perhaps in the recent past. I mean, we now have a majority on the Supreme Court who I think are much more careful about what you might call judicial lawmaking than we've had in the past.
Now, here's a question more about us and our colleagues and our mission here, about how this case fits in with the Competitive Enterprise Institute and what we're here to do. So we believe in, free markets and limited government. But there are, there's other groups in DC that spend all their time doing lawsuits and suing the government. How does this fit in with our mission?
So I think at the very center of the philosophy of limited government is the idea that Congress is limited and the Supreme Court is limited by essentially past understandings and public meanings of the texts that delineate our rights. And so when you have a 100 years of constitutional history that say an income tax necessarily requires income, when you have Supreme Court decisions that say that, when you have decisions in other courts of appeals that say that, it's fidelity to those textual values and fidelity to the text of the other documents that lay down our rights that really safeguard limited government values. And so I think that there's a kind of constitutionalism that's at the center of a limited government philosophy. And I think that is a reason, perhaps the reason, why this case is especially important to us at the Competitive Enterprise Institute.
Well, it's good. So we've sort of led up to this, but imagine we're standing in front of the justices right now. We've met them at a cocktail party or something, and we're saying, well, we should really take this case. What's the real fundamental reason why you should take our case and not 100 others? Because there's, of course, a lot of people petitioning to get to that point.
So getting before the Supreme Court is very much like 100 to 1 shot. And I won't answer your question precisely, but I want to say a little something about the kind of cases that the Supreme Court takes generally, that make, the kind of cases that the Supreme Court is more likely to accept. Because, the Supreme Court, as you suggested, doesn't have to take everything that's offered to it. It's very permissive. Unlike the rest of it, the Supreme Court gets to decide exactly what it wants to do and exactly what agenda it wants to adopt and exactly what issues it wants to decide. And one of the large areas, or to put it a different way, one of the key elements of an attractive case for the Supreme Court to take on is a case that involves what's called a circuit split. And a circuit split takes place when you have one court of appeals in one part of the country holding one thing, and another court of appeals in another part of the country holding another thing. And in fact, there have been several courts that have been pretty clear, several courts of appeals that have been pretty clear on the idea that income tax requires income, and furthermore, because income requires what's called realization. We can talk a little bit about that if you want. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is sometimes known as a bit of an outlier, sometimes known as a case that does not quite demonstrate the kind of fidelity to past decisions that judicial conservatives and judicial textualists would like to see. The Ninth Circuit, I would say, its decisions are in some tension with other decisions that have said, again, an income tax to be levied requires income, and income requires realization. The Ninth Circuit's point of view is different. The Ninth Circuit's point of view is, and let me read this to you. I was kind of fascinated by it. If I can find this passage. The Ninth Circuit's point of view is that realization of income is a constitutionally irrelevant issue, and that there is no set definition of income. And so the Ninth Circuit has a great deal of freedom to come up with its own definition of income. That's kind of how I understand the Ninth Circuit's opinion. And I think that sort of point of view discards or at least ignores settled law in the Supreme Court and in these other courts of appeals. So, and forgive me for wandering around, but let me now answer your question. The Supreme Court is very likely, when it sees different high-level courts coming to different conclusions, they're very likely to say, this is a circuit split. This is a place where different courts disagree. And so as a matter of housekeeping, we think that we ought to clarify the law. So this is a kind of case or a species of case that historically the Supreme Court has been relatively eager to take on. Another reason the Supreme Court is I think ought to be eager to take this on is related to what I was talking about before, which is that this Ninth Circuit decision really does seem to be in some tension with 100 years of law that say, in order to tax someone on their income, there has first to be income. And to expand on that a little bit, income means something like value is coming in. That's what income is. So if for instance, you own something like a house or a painting or a share of stock, and it simply becomes more valuable, there's a very strong argument that constitutionally and historically and textually, that is not income. And so the Supreme Court, I think, is going to be likely to look at this Ninth Circuit decision and say, hey, this is awfully different from the decisions that we have made in the past and the decisions that other high-level courts of appeals, or I should just say the decisions that other courts of appeals have issued. And so that's a second reason why I think that the Supreme Court is especially likely to take on this case to, as the lawyers say, to grant cert.
That I think that's excuse me, that's a great distinction that I think sort of like doesn't get mentioned that often about the realization of income or gains. Yes. People have talked about things like you said, like wealth taxes or taxing unrealized capital gains. So when someone said, oh well, during COVID, a bunch of billionaires who owned a lot of stock, their wealth increased by $50 billion, $100 billion, whether it's Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or someone like that, and they said, oh well, isn't it unfair that their net worth jumped up, but they didn't pay any taxes on it because, of course, it's not, realized. But of course, none of those people want to like give them a refund when they lose $50 billion in the stock market.
Yes.
Right? That logic never goes the other way.
Yes. Well, that's exactly right. These are paper gains. They go up, they go down. And of course, when you have someone who's a homeowner and has to pay property taxes at the state or local level, when their property taxes go up, it's not always an occasion for rejoicing because they it may be true in some sense that they are wealthier now, but it often seems to be what they see is that this wealth seems to carry more burdens than it does benefits. The only benefit that you get when your property becomes more valuable is when you sell it, which is to say when you realize something. And so the notion, right, that I think is kind of incipient, the notion that sort of underlies a lot of these things that people say about how people are becoming much wealthier because their assets are becoming more valuable. This notion, I think, is very controversial because it's when you get to the point where we're actually considering widespread taxes on solely on assets that have become more valuable, it's going to trigger a great amount of financial restructuring. It's going to trigger a great amount of debts. I mean, if you own a house and your property taxes go up, that's an obligation you have to figure out how to meet. If you own a valuable piece of art and it and suddenly you get taxed just on your possession of that, you're going to have to figure out a way to meet those obligations. If we had widespread wealth taxes, what would happen is, I think, a new financial industry would get created that would essentially be a kind of useless and almost sort of vampiric industry, because it would have to figure out a way to put liens on all these pieces of properties, such that people would have to pay these obligations immediately rather than once they realized any income. So I guess it's a little far afield from what you were talking about, but the creation of a wealth tax regime would involve so much intrusion and so much expense on everyday people's lives that there are strong political reasons that people would have to resist it, I would hope.
Well, yeah, you would think so. And, again, one of these, examples that maybe is, kind of
Yes.
easy to understand, imagine if you bought a house in the year 2000 and then it increased in price dramatically up until, 2006 or 2007, you have these sort of like paper gains in your house being more valuable.
Yes.
But what if you didn't sell it till 2010, at the bottom of the market, the crash of the Great Recession, for example? You
Yes.
would never have enjoyed any of that supposed wealth because the price would have,
It's very true.
it would have been a dive by the time you actually got anything in your bank account. All right. So,
and of course, more generally, there are many businesses and business interests that become more valuable over time. But if we were to have, I think there's one or two senators that talks about the 1% tax or the 2% tax or something like that would be levied on these fairly valuable interests and so forth. Many of these businesses are cash poor, right? I mean, it's not as if these businesses that have grown in value have like a little mansion like Scrooge McDuck had, right, with the basement being full of jewelry.
The money bin, yeah,
right. And so if you have this wealth taxes on these businesses, I mean, what's necessarily going to happen is these business interests that have increased in value, they're going to have to figure out a way to come up with the money somehow, and it's going to be a huge blow in terms to payroll or future investment or something like that. I mean, it would be really nice if all these incredibly wealthy interests, had basements like Scrooge McDuck had with the swimming pool full of diamonds. But it's really not that way in real life. The money has to come from somewhere, and a lot of these businesses are quite cash poor because they keep on pouring more and more money into growth and development.
Excellent point. Now, strategy-wise, timeline-wise, Imagine the Supreme Court does take this case, and we have a decision that substantially agrees with our argument, and the mandatory repatriation tax just it goes away. It's found unconstitutional. What's the impact?
Well, I think that it would have two impacts. The first is obvious that there's a relatively small class of people who could presumably bring suit and get back the money that they paid for their burden of the Mandatory Repatriation Act. But depending on how the decision is written, this has the possibility of being, I think, an extremely important case, perhaps one of the most important Supreme Court cases of the 21st century, perhaps the most important tax case of the 21st century, because if the Supreme Court discovers that there are serious constitutional problems with a wealth tax or a property tax that's levied at the federal level, if the Supreme Court says, we're going to stick with our 100 years of law that say you cannot tax people on unrealized gains, you cannot levy a tax that calls itself an income tax but is really a federal property tax or federal wealth tax. Well, I think that this really changes the game for people who I consider to be making promises that they're making promises. They're writing checks that the Constitution can't cash. Let's say you have elected officials who are making promises about the wonderful prospects of a wealth tax or a federal property tax or something like that. I think that there's some prospect that a forthcoming case could be history making, because it would foreclose what I consider to be a huge menace on the horizon, which is the looming specter of a wealth tax at the federal level.
Well, yeah, so you might have people like, we know prominent elected officials like Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont or Senator
Yes.
Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who have supported ideas like this in the past, that they would be sort of preemptively burned, and like the cat that touches the hot stove. If they already know that the Supreme Court is not well disposed to consider those policies like that constitutional, they would be much less likely to try and go through the complicated lobbying process of trying to enact one in the first place.
Oh, very much so. I watched the State of the Union recently, and it seemed to me that every time President Biden was talking about another big government program, I saw Elizabeth Warren jump up and begin to clap ecstatically. I have to say that her reaction to this Supreme Court case, if it goes the way I think it's going to go, would be much less positive.
Yes. So this is sort of a bigger picture, question about taxes and policy in general. But there's been a lot of debate over the decades about certain classes of Americans supposedly don't pay enough in taxes, and there have been all sorts of efforts, complicated efforts over the years to try and chase them down and supposedly catch them for shortchanging Uncle Sam. And so we've been on the personal income side, we've had what they've called the alternative minimum tax, or AMT. We've had that for over 50 years, where you have to do your taxes twice basically, and then you pay the more of whichever of these two scenarios there is. And then just last year in the Inflation Reduction Act, we had sort of like the business version of that, the corporate minimum tax, which is supposedly going to be 15% now. That all of this sort of raises the question about, wouldn't it be easier just to streamline the tax code instead of having an extremely complicated tax code and then having to create multiple additional taxes on top of that?
Oh, of course, and I think you might agree with me that one of the great public policy successes of the last couple of decades was the 1986 tax reform, which was a huge blow for huge blow in favor of, and huge progress for tax simplification. Much easier to figure out what your tax obligations are, eliminating a huge deadweight loss on the economy of people spending hours and hours trying to figure out how much they owe and so forth. But I fear that accretion of new tax provisions and the growth of a more and more complex tax code is a kind of inevitable dynamic, unless and until you have people who say, that thing that we did in 1986? We really ought to do it again. Until we have an attitude that says we essentially need to sweep out the barn every 10 years, right? These provisions are going to grow and grow because the tax code will grow, the complexity will increase, and so on and so forth. And now I'm going to say something that my wife rolls her eyes whenever I say this. I'll just say, I learned an important lesson about this back when I was a state legislator. So let me tell you what that is. It seems to me that there's almost a cultural consensus that the tax code really ought to be used to accomplish all sorts of wonderful, socially beneficial objectives. We ought to use the tax code to encourage people to invest in education, to encourage people to own a home, to discourage people from drinking and smoking, and so on and so forth. And as long as you have that cultural perspective, you are going to have pressure for a longer and more extensive tax code because there is really no limit to the wonderful ideas that some policymaker will have to encourage or discourage people from carrying out some sort of code of conduct. And I remember back when I was a state legislator, I used to try to explain to my fellow legislators, instead of passing these new tax provisions that would encourage or discourage certain kinds of behavior, maybe we could just sort of like get away from this idea and just try to efficiently collect the kind of money we need and not worry about using the tax code to make society a better place. And many legislators looked at me as if I were from Mars. I mean, they really couldn't understand that. And I think that that's not just a legislative attitude, but I think that's a popular attitude, that we really need to be in the business of trying to encourage people to be better through the tax code, which I think it's a dangerous and confused idea, really. But there was always I was in the minority party when I was in the legislature, and there were always a few people who sort of saw things my way and said, maybe, if we're really in the business of trying to affect people's behavior, maybe we just ought to do it directly and not worry about the tax code. Let's just let the tax code take care of itself and just solely serve as an efficient revenue collection mechanism. But I fear that once my friends left the minority and became the majority, their reaction to me was, Dan, I guess I could see back in the old days how your ideas made a little sense, but I've now grown and matured, and now that I'm in the majority, now that I'm with a group of people who agree with me, we're the majority. Do you realize the immense power we have to get our ideas passed into law so that we can encourage people and discourage people the way we want society to look like? Mm. And so it's a dynamic using the tax code to encourage and discourage people's behavior, very dangerous and very common. And unless and until we have a different cultural consensus that says, we really ought to stay away from using the tax code as a method of social engineering, I fear that the complexity and the burden of the tax code is going to grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, Dan, I think that's a great point about probably applies to a lot of other areas of policy as well, about the sort of like the short-term politics versus the long-term kind of political theory about what kind of system we should have. Right. Because at any given point, I mean, the reason why all of these, tax provisions, federal tax provisions or ones at the state level, the reason why they exist in the first place is because they were politically popular enough to pass, right? It's not like they were, it's not, it's not like the Sauron deduction for pure evil, right? They all sounded exactly nice. Right. At the time, and
they're in there because someone liked them. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so you have policymakers who, for any individual tax cut, tax credit, tax deduction provision, they're put in the position of saying like, well, how could you be opposed to the cute puppies tax deduction of 2023? Why do you hate cute puppies?
That's exactly right. So we have a ship. We're in a ship right now, and the ship has many barnacles on it. And in 1986, we decided we just need to shave a lot of these barnacles off the ship. And I fear that unless we have a cultural consensus that says every now and then we just need to get rid of all the barnacles on the ship, I fear that the tax code will increase in growth and burdensomeness and complexity. So these problems are ultimately a failure of ideas.
All right. Well, let's go back to we'll circle back to the specific case If people, is there anything else about this case with Kathleen and Charles Moore and this unconstitutional repatriation tax? Is there anything else we should keep in mind as we're looking forward?
Well, I think that we've covered it, and particularly I think that we've covered the likely political significance of this case, in that it appears to be about a very tiny issue, which is to say, it appears to be about one very tiny part of the tax burden. But I think that it is reasonably likely that Supreme Court may, in its logic, reveal that there are larger problems with a scheme of federal property taxes or federal wealth taxes. Uh, 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 I, my own view is that the last century, 100 years worth of tax law provides very solid ground for the Supreme Court to lay down a marker or uh, install a stop sign that instructs policymakers that here's a place that you just can't go.
All right. Well, I know some of our listeners are going to be excited to see where this case goes. How should they keep up with the progress on the case?
Oh, I think a pretty easy way to keep up on the progress of the case is just check out our website, because we have a more case page. Just go to cei.org and go to our litigation page, and we every time a judicial body makes a decision, we put that up. Just about every time someone files something of significance, we put that up. So very shortly, when we file our cert petition, which is a fancy or technical term for our request to the court to take a look at this case, more or less as soon as we file that with the court, we will put up the petition on our website. So all you got to do is go to cei.org, and you can be about as well informed about the case as you would like.
All right. And of course, I would suggest people to make sure to keep listening to this podcast, Free the Economy. We will, of course, provide updates as the case moves forward. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for being with us today. I feel like we've all learned a lot something.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.